thank you so much for joining, everyone, to a lovely Friday. It's sunny in Nottingham, I think. It's the first time I've actually looked out the window, and I'm like, actually, that's a bit cloudy. But so it's really great having the wonderful Joe Crowley here from 1927, who's going to talk all about internationalising your practice. I can never say that, nor can I spell it. I can't spell the word internationalising. I've spelt it wrong like 8 times. But it's going to be about 2 hours long. We might take a break in the middle. We might power on depending on how other people are feeling. We've got captions, and this is being recorded as well. If anyone isn't comfortable being on camera, if you ask a question, or if you just don't want your face, you can keep your camera off, that's fine. But also just let me know, and then I'll edit around you, because we're going to be distributing this on the website after. And that's it, really. I'll let Joe talk about everything else. I'm going to be here the whole time monitoring the chat. So I will try to find some nice lull periods if people have asked questions as well. If you pop them in there, I'll interrupt and say we've got some questions. Or if not, I'll let Joe talk about if you can shout out or not. I don't know. It's been a while. But yeah, right. Thank you so much, Joe.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I feel like I'm talking to loads of names. And I'm going to start by saying I'm recovering from laryngitis. So I'm going to apologize in advance if I suddenly have to cough, in which case I will silence my audio. But yeah, just a little bit about this session. So we will talk through it. We're talking for roughly 2 hours. The plan is to have kind of a space for like 10-15 minutes worth of questions and at the end and discussion. But if anyone has any kind of questions about some of the stuff I'm talking about, please feel free to kind of raise your hands, pop a note in the chats, and we'll try and kind of track some of those as we go, rather than kind of storing them all up for the end. So a little bit about this session. First of all, I'm going to share my screen. Just bear with me while I attempt to share a document that I have open, which it doesn't seem to let me do. Sorry, everybody. I don't know why it's not letting me do that. Anna, see you still there? Do you know why I can't share a document?
Oh, sorry, one moment. Let me just have a check.
My computer.
No.
We should have tested this, shouldn't we, really?
You should be able to, in theory, be able to. Is it trying to share your screen?
Yeah, I am.
Interesting. One moment. Let me have a gander. Sorry, everyone. This is like the fun time of Zoom where you get to watch everyone try and learn how to do a thing.
I mean, let's not worry if we can't. I'll just chat through. It just means you're going to listen to watch me the whole time rather than me sharing some things.
I'll try and figure it out.
Really importantly, if I can't share, please tell me to slow down, to repeat things, to ask questions, because I'm really aware that otherwise you're just going to hear me talking to you, or talking at you potentially. So also just to say that I will, if we can't share it, I will also send on these slides so you can have a look at them afterwards. So in this session, we are going to talk about why working internationally is something you want to consider doing. We're going to talk about internationalizing your creative practice and what opportunities there are out there for artists, for producers, for companies, for kind of creative practitioners. We're going to talk about touring work in particular, because some of the elements of touring are as relevant for any overseas work you're practically undertaking. So we'll kind of go through a bit more of the nuts and bolts of touring there. And we'll talk about some information, and I'll share some information points and signposting and resources at the very end, which might be of use and reference and interest. Shall I start by telling you a little bit about me and why I think I've been asked to do this? So I'm Jo. My pronouns are she and her. I am a producer, and I've spent the last kind of 20 years working in the performing arts, in theatre largely, working with theatre companies and dance arts organisations, but largely most of my practice, with the exception of 2 years, has been working completely with artists and companies who make new work. So everything I do is around the kind of creation of work and the dissemination of that work, and trying to make sure that artists' work is reaching the widest possible audience. Somewhere along the line, some of the artists I started working with began to work internationally, and that's become a kind of cornerstone of my practice now. So it's a little bit more, I have worked with a number of artists and companies, presenting works in 50 countries across 6 continents, both as touring work, licensing work, co-producing work, creating work that's been commissioned, and also undertaking residencies across the globe. In terms of where I've worked, 50 countries across 6 continents, and co-producing and making kind of commissioned work with festivals and venues in the US, Europe, and Australia. But like I say, I have toured and undertaken work in a wider kind of range of countries and continents. The other thing I should say is that I've been a very active member of international networks for the last probably 12 years, which we'll talk a little bit about what that means. And a few years ago, I co-founded the project Another Route, which was a project that was set up by myself and another colleague, artist and producer, Andy Field, who's one of the founders of Forest Fringe. And Andy and I set up Another Route to support a new generation of independent theatre companies, artists, dance practitioners, circus practitioners, to internationalise their creative practice through a project that was to support companies and artists to follow an alternative route to mobilising themselves internationally outside of showcasing. So Another Route brought together Total Theatre, Forest Fringe, working in collaboration with the Arts Admin and a consortium of extensively experienced UK artists and companies who have worked internationally to support a new generation. So we had 12 artists and companies who were selected across theatre, dance, circus, live arts, to undertake a kind of 1.5 year long project to internationalise their practice through kind of laboratories, residencies, commissions, and I'll maybe talk a little bit more about that because some of you might have some questions about that. And the other thing in terms of internationally that I've been doing is I'm the co-founder of co-director of the Total Theatre Network, which is the kind of banner under which we co-created Another Route. But the Total Theatre Network has historically run the Total Theatre Awards at the Edinburgh Festivals, Edinburgh Festival Fringe. And so as part of that process, which has been on pause since the pandemic, just because of the state of the world, but we would bring together UK and international artists, practitioners, critics, academics, programmers, curators every summer to kind of collectively see work and have a kind of dialogue, discourse process with each other. So that's me. Has anyone got any questions they want to ask or anything they want to say about me slowing down, talking in a different way before I move on? Silence. I'm just looking at names, which is
good, I think.
fantastic. Croaky voice here. I just kind of want to check. I'm like, everyone okay? Fantastic. Brilliant. Okay, so the first thing, and I might speed through this, by the way, if there's nothing anyone wants to say, but please do interrupt. Turn your screen on, put your hands up, ask me a question, pop it in the chat. Either, really happy to respond. And I'd quite like this to be conversational as much as possible, because otherwise I'll just share what I know. What I should have said when I was introducing myself is everything I'm sharing is coming from my experience and my practice. So there will be other things that other artist producers or artists or companies might suggest, or other organisations that work internationally. So I'm drawing on my knowledge, so it's not everything, but it is based on kind of practical experience. So that's kind of what I'm talking about, where I'm coming from, and I will try and draw on some of the actual experiences I've had to kind of give a bit of context for it in practice, if that makes sense. So, why work internationally? Big question. Lots of people want to work internationally. And I think sometimes it's because they want to travel, which is kind of fine and legitimate. Sometimes it's because people want their work to reach a big audience. Sometimes it's because they can see opportunities that peers have because they've been working internationally. But very importantly, I think why work internationally is about a number of things. It's about broadening horizons. It enables mobility and connectivity. Going back to broadening horizons, working internationally, seeing work, meeting artists, presenting work in another context, helps you to kind of discover new ways of working, new artists, new practices, new audiences, contexts outside of England, which kind of really help very quickly professionalize you as an artist, as a company. It does help to kind of raise the bar a little in your work. And I think ultimately it can kind of increase creativity and curiosity, which can significantly impact the work that you then do create, make, and share with audiences in England, in your regions, nationally, across the UK, and then, of course, internationally. So for me, internationalising, the reason I talk about internationalising practice is because I kind of step back on the last 20 years and think, why? What's important about that? Rather than me going, this is how you tour work internationally. It's helped me become the person that I am. It's helped me become the producer that I am. It's helped the artists that I work with grow their insight, their ability, their creativity, develop their expertise. And also, and I can't not state this, it has provided a model financially that has helped to sustain the livelihoods of the artists I worked with. So if I use the example of 1927, 1927 has always toured internationally. We opened our first show at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2007, to playing in a 50-seat underbelly space. We'd never made a show before. It was our first theatre show. We didn't have a bank account. We weren't a company. It was entirely new. It was a bunch of friends getting together that made a thing. But I'd been practicing for a long time. So weren't entirely brand new, but new as a kind of entity. I think within 3 months, 1927, we're touring to Brussels and then to New York, and then everything else has kind of come from that. So we have immediately been touring work internationally, having started from the very beginning. So it's been embedded in our practice. The reason I mention this is we are an NPO now. We became an NPO in 2017. So we spent 10 years surviving as a company on the basis of our international practice and our international work and extensive international touring and some kind of collaborations that we did. So when I talk about how I think the opportunities it opens, the doors it opens in terms of broadening horizons, professionalizing practice, raising the bar, I'm really, really basing that on the fact of seeing a company that had no experience, barely in the UK, going on a trajectory that has been highly influenced by the work that they've been experiencing internationally. So yeah, that's kind of, I think what's important is that working internationally really also offers space. It offers space for professional development and critical reflection. It really does help you expand your reach, and it does help build networks, and really importantly, it helps build peer-to-peer networks across the globe. I think when we're working here in England in particular climates, we can be very blinded by the situations that we're working in, the operation and the kind of spaces that we're working in, and the kind of constraints or the frustrations of funders here in England. And actually, by working internationally, by connecting with peers across the globe, it begins to kind of change our perspective on how what we do is supported, not supported, could be kind of made in alternative ways. So I cannot underestimate how much connecting with artists, whether those are in extremely privileged contexts, such as Belgium, where there's masses of funding, and you kind of talk to artists and they talk about the fact they've just been given a 10-year national portfolio equivalent grant, and you're like, 10 years? Wow. And then you talk to artists in places where there's no infrastructure, there's no arts infrastructure, there's barely any infrastructure, and they're still making extraordinary work. So it's kind of interesting balancing those two things then in your own practice once you've kind of met those artists, experienced that work, seen how different audiences in different places kind of receive what you're doing. The other thing to say about working internationally is it does build profile and it builds recognition, which again, when you're a small company or a solo artist, really helps you continue to do this work, and to kind of carve a pathway that enables you to practice and to kind of do what you do. Basically, I think there's no two ways around it. I wouldn't do what I do had the artists and companies I'd worked with not been working internationally, because I don't think we could necessarily have survived and wouldn't have made the quality of work we've made without some of the international experiences and opportunities that we've had. Great. Does anyone else have any questions they want to ask about internationalizing practice and why, or what you think that might be, or any questions you've got around that? You don't have to put any.
You might go into this later, but did you, and you probably will because it's the whole point. Did you find it is, because obviously you work internationally now as well, do you find that like obviously with Brexit and everything in the world has gotten harder, but do you think about like working internationally back then versus now that the dynamic has changed a lot?
Yeah, I will come to this, but it is worth absolutely, naming the couple of elephants in the room, which absolutely have meant that I'm talking from a place where we are still working internationally, but in a very different space, I would say, and in a very different world, post-pandemic, post-Brexit, and with a world, frankly, that is on fire at the moment. It is having huge implications on what we're doing, where we do it, things, why we would do it, whether we want to do it, whether we should do it. And so that needs acknowledging from the offset. So I'm going to share my knowledge, but it's largely based on experience in the last 10 to 15 years, whilst also populated with some of the experiences that are kind of we're dealing with now, the reality of that. So yes is the answer, definitely. And I will come to Europe because it has had a very significant impact. But I think the really important thing for me to say, just to reiterate, when I say, hey, we've been to 50 countries across 6 continents, it's not gloating. It's me stating there is opportunity, there is work, there are things outside of Europe, there always has been. And actually, in terms of the presentation of work, I would say most of the companies and artists I work with, our work was more weighted outside of Europe than it was within Europe over the last kind of decade or two. So that's kind of interesting to know. But it does also mean that there are things that I'm noticing. I'm like, that's because of Brexit, which is frustrating. And then there are things that I'm like, yeah, but that's okay because we know how to do that because we've been doing it for all the other countries. I'm going to talk through the pragmatic, nuts and bolts, and don't be scared. But there are some things which is ultimately around things like Creative Europe, which we will come to, but also there are actions that we can all do around that.
Have you found a difference between doing international work as a solo artist versus a company?
Not really, no. I mean, it's worth noting I work with really small, tiny companies that have a, huge output, but they're tiny. 1927, there's 4 of us, 5 of us, 6 of us, I think about everyone who works with us administratively. But that's the whole company. That's like the creative leadership team and all of our team. And I find that most solo artists also have a bunch of collaborators. And yeah, internationally, I don't think there's much difference. Maybe if you're solo, there might be more opportunities, perhaps, but perhaps not. Depends on scale. No different, I would say. Yeah.
And then there's another question here from Rachel, who said, hoping to move to Germany in Feb. Good luck on that. Bit concerned about the possible 30-day limit to other European countries restriction on a visa. Any advice on this? Also, what's a great way to get connections elsewhere when you only speak a very small amount of that language? I'm an actor, but open to making two with experience in R&D, devising, and also filmmaker. You may go into this a little bit more.
We will touch on visas and permits, and Europe is complicated. It's worth stating that. So we will touch on that, but I might not have a specific answer, I'll be honest, to that specific question. In terms of think we will come to networks and mobility. I think we'll talk through it, and then maybe there'll be some ideas in the mix of how you can kind of connect with people.
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool. And we'll just continue then, Vlada, because I saw you answer a question, but just in case things get answered.
Yeah, of course.
Let's head straight through.
Great, fantastic. So we are going to now talk about, and this is where I'm just going to pull up the thing that I can't share with you so I can just double check my notes, which is, in terms of internationalizing your creative practice, I would say there are a range of opportunities internationally, all of which I will outline now and then talk through in more detail, and perhaps then you might have some questions as we go. So the key opportunities that I would want to talk to you about are residencies, first thing, developing new work, so commissioning and co-productions and working with international partners on those things. I'd quite like to talk about licensing internationally, which is another thing which you may or may not be aware of. I will talk about building connections, networking, and peer-to-peer working, because I think that's really key about how you can navigate through the international territories. We'll touch on some showcases, platforms, arts markets, and then we'll look in more detail about the nuts and bolts of touring, and all of the kind of logistical considerations that go with that, which are transferable to any kind of context really where you're having to work outside of cross-border or outside of the United Kingdom. And it's just to be clear, I will be talking on the whole for artists and companies and individuals who are based in the UK who are looking to work overseas. It doesn't mean to say you have to be a UK national at all. It's more about being based here and what that might mean. So does that sound okay? Good? Yes? Fantastic. So residencies. I think I'm really mindful that kind of wanting to get your work out is challenging. And wanting to find that way of how you connect with people internationally is like, how do I start? Where do I start? There are different ways for you as an individual, for you as a collective, for you as a company, if you're a part of a collective or a company or an ensemble or a duo or a whatever, which is to kind of look at residencies and opportunities. It can be a really good way of dipping toes into water, kind of testing grounds. Residencies offer the opportunity to develop insight into places, to build connections, to grow your networks, and then really importantly and strategically to seed international life for your future practice and your future work. The other thing that residencies do, and undertaking residencies outside of kind of in fact, I mean, it doesn't even need to be overseas, undertaking a residency away from home just kind of offers a space for reflection and creative development. I think sometimes working in the arts, we don't really carve time for. And I really, really think it's invaluable in terms of what that space can do and what it offers in terms of, having some time out, exploring something creatively. So in terms of what kind of residencies are there are two types of residencies, I would say, on the whole, internationally. There are residencies you can apply for. Lots of organisations run residencies. There are hundreds, thousands possibly, of residency spaces for artists across the globe. Many of them will have open access applications. Many of them will support you and resource you to be in those places. Sometimes those residency spaces might come with a studio and some accommodation. Sometimes it might be a country house. Sometimes it can take all sorts of forms. But I really think sorry, obviously people are now starting to call me on Friday afternoon. As soon as I'm in a Zoom, apologies for getting my phone ringing there. So residencies are a really valuable way of seeding opportunity, and for you beginning to understand how it is to work in another place, if you haven't, or if you have, to develop new relationships. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples of residencies that I have undertaken or organised for artists or myself or producers, just as some examples. So and actually what I should say is, because the Brexit question has been raised, one of the things that has happened with Brexit is that the United Kingdom is no longer part of the Creative Europe programme. So what that has meant is there are some EU opportunities, including residencies, which are funded by the European Commission, that we are not eligible to apply for. So I guess there's been a shrinkage of spaces and places that we can engage with, but not entirely, because many residency spaces are attached to organisations or independently run, and they kind of generally are open for anyone coming. There are also some potential costs attached to bringing over UK passport holders that go with that. So it's worth flagging that it might impact some of this. Although interestingly, I think I'm about to share some example. In fact, none of what I'm about to share were in Europe. So there we go. So residency. So I've mentioned another route, the programme which we have run, which has just finished actually, which we ran for 12 artists and companies to internationalise their creative practice. As part of that, we undertook to organise a minimum of 12 residencies for each artist across the globe. In reality, we ended up organising about 22 residencies across the globe, which took artists from anything from a 2-week residency to Northern Norway, to Taiwan, to Japan, to a 2-month residency in Australia, to 3-week trips to Brazil, utilising the consortium's network of contacts. We were able to kind of broker introductions to an artist that was part of another route, and they all undertook residencies. The reason we did that was because we all, as producers, as artists, as companies on the consortium and behind another route, genuinely believe that we know that being in places, making work, seeing work, connecting with artists is how you begin to develop the ability to work internationally. So that was a number of residencies that we very quickly organised and kind of sent artists off across the globe, a network across the globe. So another residency that I'm going to talk about is I work with an artist called Kazuko Hoki. And Kazuko Hoki is an artist who has been making, she's in her 70s now, she's been making theatre and live art, and has been part of a punk pop band for many years. And it was quite a long time ago now, it was about 10 years ago. We applied for one of the open residencies that I found with a theatre called Norldand Visual Theatre, which is based in Stamsund in the Lofoten Islands in northern Norway in the Arctic Circle. They have an open call out for residencies and, importantly, later down the line, co-productions that anyone across the globe who is working in the territories of visual performance or puppetry is allowed to apply for. And because we were making a piece of visual work, we had an idea of a project, we thought, well, let's just ask them. So what happened was we applied for the residency programme. We were invited over to meet with the venue and the building. I can say it. In fact, I will follow on with some of these. So it's Norldand Visual Theatre is the English language name of it.
I was just thinking, Jo, if you get a second, could you send me your thing, and then I'll see if I can pull up on my screen.
Yeah, perfect. Great. Yeah, so I'll finish talking about this and I'll kind of have a moment, breathe and do that. Yeah, so Northern Visual Theatre. So we were kind of invited over, had a kind of 3-day meeting with the theatre. It's a theatre on an island off Norway, in the Arctic Circle. We arrived, it was December, 24-hour darkness, and met with the team, talked through the project. They brought us over, they paid for us to get there. And then we went back the following summer and undertook a residency where they gave us the keys to the building, to the theatre, because they were all going on holiday. They gave us keys to apartments, to 2 houses, and they said, have a nice month. And they paid for us to go there. They gave us a per diem, they organised our flights, they organised the transportation, and they gave us the space. We raised a little bit of money from Arts Council England to undertake some R&D. And we had a month-long residency in a tiny fishing village, in a village where the population is comprised largely of artists, fisher people, and oil workers, which is a bizarre combination with I think the population was 200 people. It was absolutely stunning. When I send the screens, the images that I've got, there's some images that I will show you. It was full on Arctic conditions, but in the summer it was 24-hour daylight. It was an incredible residency. That residency, because it worked very well, we went back and did another residency, and then we went back a third time in co-production with the venue, created the show that we were developing, and then we toured it across northern Norway, and then we brought it back the following year. So us applying for a residency initially to be part of the jigsaw puzzle of our plan for making the show for Kazuko as an independent artist, but with a bunch of collaborators. And I think we got £14,000 from Arts Council England at the time, which is part of our kind of strategy of, well, that'd be nice, that's interesting. But also because of the theme and the subject matter, which was kind of exploring the relationship between Sami people and the Japanese people, and folk tales and folk trilogies, and a whole other story around anyway, it made sense. But the point being that if you make visual performance, that is an example of a residency that's an open call residency that anyone can apply for. Many UK-based companies and artists have developed work in Stamsund. It's a wonderful place. It's completely hermetically sealed. There's nothing there. There's a supermarket and there is a hotel that opens when the Hurtigruten ship that sails lands and docks, and then they open and the bar opens, and that's it. Like, there's nothing there. So all you can do is be in amongst beauty, make performance and have some space. So that's an example of how a residency really did kind of go on to become a co-production, and it was something we applied for completely ourselves, and it was an open call out, responding to an open call. 2 other examples of residencies, because I just think it's useful to share some of these things. This is a really strategic residency that I organised for 1927. 1927 had made one show. We were invited to Australia to present that show in one venue. because I had worked with another company, Historically Ridiculous, once you'd done lots of work in Australia, I was able personally to use some of those contacts to persuade another venue that perhaps they should also present that work, which, having spoken to Sydney Opera House, who were bringing us over, were persuaded that, yeah, that would be a great thing to do. Fast forward kind of 6 months later, and we're thinking about the new show we're going to make, and we're like, how do we do this? We asked the second venue that we went to, because we thought Sydney Opera House are never going to give us a residency, but maybe the Malt House in Melbourne might. We were going on tour to the Perth Festival with our first show, which felt a bit irresponsible to fly all the way to Australia for 1 week for one engagement. So I asked the Malt House Theatre whether they perhaps might want to offer us a residency space, to give us a studio space, some accommodation, so we could extend our stay in Australia to minimise our kind of impact on the globe, but also because we were beginning to develop new work. They said yes. Now, two things. Strategically, I was thinking, if I can get a residency internationally, maybe we might be able to seed a future for the next show in that country, which automatically then gives it an international presence. So I was being strategic, I was being clever, I was using the knowledge I'd had from other artists and companies I'd worked with to think, can we have not just toured our first show internationally, can we also look at where the second show is automatically an international UK collaboration? So we went to Australia. We had a 2-week went on tour, did like 10 days, did a week in Perth. Then we went and did a 2.5-week residency at the Malt House. The Malt House said to me, oh my God, it was incredible to have the artists and the company. Delight, we loved it. The company themselves were actually playing table tennis downstairs, having a crisis of confidence, going, oh my God, how do we make a second show? We don't know what to do. They literally didn't know what they were doing. But to the rest of the team at the Malt House, they were just a nice dynamic to have in the building. And fast forward a few months later, I met the executive producer of the Malt House when he visited the UK for the Edinburgh festivals, and he said, yes, we would like to commission the show. So I was like, that strategy worked. We now have an international commission partner on our second show, which actually meant that show, which went on to kind of tour for like 6 or 7 years, had an international co-commission partner, but also actually premiered internationally before landing here in the UK, which was again really important in terms of us raising the bar, the level of expectation, giving ourselves enough time to work and create that piece of work. Yeah, so that's another example of a residency, which was a self-initiated, self-organised residency. Didn't cost us anything other than fees for the artists, which we'd already applied for some R&D to support, because the Perth Festival paid for our flights, and then the Malt House Theatre in Melbourne hosted us and gave us accommodation and a per diem. Then the last residency I'm going to talk about is just me as a producer, which kind of comes from the importance of networks, actually. I'm part of a network called the IETM, which is a membership organisation of a number of international arts companies, independents, all sorts of organisations. They have 2 meetings a year in Europe. A bunch of us have kind of been getting to know each other very well, and talked about, wouldn't it be nice to kind of spend more time together? So an Australian producer who was part of that network sent an invitation to about 40 of us and said, is anyone planning to be in Australia for the kind of festival seasons in the kind of first 2 months of the year? This was about 7 years ago. If you are, we've got a retreat space in the Australian outback. Fast forward 6 months later, I found myself with 15 other people, 5 of whom maybe I'd met before, knew, 10 who I didn't know, living, working, hanging out, having discussions, exploring, working internationally in the middle of Australia, the Australian outback. Again, an international residency space called the Bundanoon, Bundanoon. And they have 2 spaces in rural Australia. Again, I should say that 1927 were on tour with a show that was going to Sydney and to somewhere else at the same time, to Adelaide at the same time. Kazuko Hoki, who I mentioned earlier, was also on tour in the Australian festivals. So I was able to be like, I've got my flight paid for. All I need to do is get myself to Bundanoon, and then we all agreed to give £150 or $150, I think it was, for food. And then we basically all cooked, ate, lived, worked, hung out together in the middle of nowhere. It was the most extraordinary week I've ever had. So I'm sharing these because basically there are residencies you can apply for, there are residencies you can ask people for, and there are residencies that you can initiate. Don't hold back if you want to spend time in other places with other people, exploring things, looking at it. Those examples of those different residencies have been transformational in terms of what I've done and the artists I work with do, and what a number of my peers who participated have gone on to do. Does anyone have any questions about residencies before we move on? Nope. Oh, yeah, there is I've got a resource. There's an organisation, there's many places. What I would say is join loads of mailing lists. So join the international networks and mailing lists. You don't have to be members of some of these things. You can just sign up to, for example, onthemove.org. Sign up. They will publish if there's residencies in Europe. There's an organisation, I'm just going to write this down, but again, I will send this over, called resarts.org. Sorry, it's just automatically auto-correcting it. Resarts.org, which is a membership organisation for residency spaces across the globe. And you can go onto their website and there's a global listing of over 650 different actual residency spaces. So there are loads of places to kind of look, but the key thing I would say is join up to as many kind of like mailing lists and newsletters as you can, because it will share opportunities. Talk to other artists, talk to other companies, see whether they've got any recommendations of places you might go. There are kind of like residencies and retreat spaces that are slightly more independent. Look on things like the Arts Admin newsletter thing, they will sometimes be posted there. Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of places, and sometimes they're hidden away. But yeah, you can find them in all sorts of places. Does that answer the question? Great, fantastic. In terms of whether it covers fees, I've never undertaken a residency that did not support the costs. But there are some that will ask you maybe to get yourself to a place, and then they might provide food, or they might provide some element of support. Some are completely funded, and that's when I kind of mentioned the EU ones that we might not be able to apply for might be fully funded, fully financed. But it depends on the organisations, and it depends on their financing structure. Yeah, I mean, I would say it's an interesting one in terms of artist fees. I as a producer would never send an artist on a retreat without finding the resource to pay them at all. I might decide to undertake a retreat myself as a producer and not be paid, because I'm using it as an opportunity for professional development, if that makes sense. So like when I was in Australia and I did that retreat in Bundanoon, no one was paying me for that week I was in Bundanoon, but everyone was paying me either side. And also I got to spend a week in the Australian outback, and I don't really get much time to do any training or reflection or space. So I decided that, you know what, I'll take one for the team and I'll take it on. But I would never send anyone not to without being paid. And some residency spaces will provide a fee. But those are probably rarer than those that won't, if that makes sense. Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about, what time are we on? Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit now about residencies and about commissions and co-productions internationally. I guess commissions and co-productions are the kind of golden ticket internationally. It's the, yes, come on, who doesn't want money for work? And historically, international commissions, co-productions can be significant cash, actually. I mean, I'm not going to lie about that. Sometimes they can just be a tiny seed, but they are, yeah, I mean, they're kind of invaluable. And I guess I'll talk a little bit about why they're useful, and then I'll talk a little bit about how you might think about going to try and make them happen, get them. Ultimately, yeah, they provide cash, they provide resource, they provide support. But really, I think what an international co-production or commission does is it gives you credibility, and it gives a kind of it gives a visibility to others that makes them curious about who you are, what you do, and maybe they should be paying attention. So it massively builds the profile of how your work and practice is perceived, is the first thing to say. If you're making work that's a co-production and you're also presenting it here, it does often also increase the fundability of that work here. Because again, it's about someone else endorsing it, and it's someone in another country going, this work by this artist is world class. And so we want to support them, which makes the arts councils here kind of go, oh, maybe we should pay attention to this work and this practice. It does also really carve a pathway for international future working and dissemination. If you're making a show in co-production or it has been commissioned by an overseas partner, it's very unlikely that that overseas partner won't present it. And if that overseas partner does present it and brings you over to present it, they might also want some of their regional peers to also present it. And so what happens is you begin to have this kind of little spider's web sewn for you of touring without even trying. And the thing that I think doesn't really get talked about, but I think does need given some honest visibility, which is that there's a kind of domino effect that happens with international work. And there's a kind of, there's a domino effect where, in all honesty, promoters of programs can be quite lazy. And so if they see that someone else has got something, then they might want that too. And I've seen that happen repeatedly. So actually you end up not really having to book the tours because the tour almost books itself. Because so-and-so in one place goes, well, if they've got it, I want it. And then they contact you and say, can I come and have it? And then suddenly it happens and it all begins to, this little spider's web just grows, where you are disseminating your work and you haven't massively even tried. And that's, I think it's just important to say that. So that doesn't require commissioning or co-production. Once you've kind of had some residencies or had some visibility or some connectivity, that can happen. But it is, it's worth acknowledging. So, it validates your work for funders. It validates your work for presenters and programmers and promoters here in this country. It validates your work for other overseas partners. How do you get commissioning, co-production money? It is hard. It is almost impossible to get it in this country right now. Commissioning, co-production money, gone on the whole, especially if you're working in particular art forms or in particular forms of practices, and particularly if you're making new work, which is considered quite risky. It can be challenging. But and that is the same internationally. It's perhaps not as challenging as it is here, but it's in terms of how you go about trying to find commission partners or co-production partners. It really is about having gotten to know organisations. It's nearly impossible to, out of the blue, coldly contact somebody and say, hello, can I, would you commission my work? Do you co-produce my work? Would you, whatever? You can, but really you want to have grown relationships. That's why things like residencies, like networking, like touring are what begin to seed or increase the likelihood of you potentially being commissioned or co-produced. And if we look at commissioning, you may not have toured work, but you may have undertaken a residency. And if you've undertaken a residency and that residency partner has a space and they're kind of like, we're really interested in your practice, actually, we'd love to present it, we'll give you a little bit of resource. That's the beginning of how things happen. Like I say, if I go back to 1927 when we made our second show, Australia agreed to give us, it was £5,000. It was a lot of money at the time, but that was their commission. But it didn't matter because that commission seeded them being the first presenting partner, but because of dates, the presenting partner couldn't present it first. So it meant that we had our world premiere at another partner that they'd organised us to tour to, which was Sydney Opera House. So we opened our second show at Sydney Opera House on a £5,000 commission from the Moore House. Fast forward to the third show, we had £200,000 worth of international co-production money from major festivals. So it really is just about sowing seeds, asking questions, asking opportunities, talking to who you know, daring to get to know those possible partners. Sometimes I would say it's not about asking for commissioning money or co-production money. I always, when I approach UK and international partners, actually, is talk to them about a new project we're developing, and I ask them whether they might like to be a partner on the journey with us. And I really honestly say that might be a development partner, that might be a commissioning partner, it might be a co-production partner, it might just be a future presenting partner. So you kind of put all of the options out on the table, and usually someone will say, I'll go for that one. And some will say, I'll just take it when it's finished. Some will say, what do you mean by development partner? And then you kind of go, well, you know, maybe you could host us for a residency. Maybe we could take a production week with you. Maybe we could premiere with you. And then sometimes that leads to the conversation evolving, and then they do begin to support you. And you begin to go, well, wait a second, shall I present this as a commission? Because actually you've given us 2 weeks in kind space, you paid a little bit of resource. And it becomes, and they kind of go, yeah, that'd be great. And then again, that's how you present it to funders, to future programmers, etc. So I never ask for co-production money. I just go, would you like to be a development partner on the show, and explain all the things that might be, including residencies, which again, you know, that kind of embedded placemaking of things. There are also open calls sometimes for co-productions. Having mentioned Norldand Visual Theatre already in northern Norway, that is like I said, they do public call outs for residencies. They also have a co-production fund that they ask people to apply for. They will encourage you to undertake a pre-production residency before they commit to that, but you can apply for it, and you know that can be quite a significant amount of resource and money. There are other smaller, I went on the On the Move website yesterday just doing a quick bit of research, and whilst there might not be an opportunity now to be like, oh my God, you can apply, but if you're an artist based in Slovenia and you want to work in Serbia, you can apply at the moment for a £2,500 co-production. Like there are things like that come up all the time, which are around strategic partnerships. Yeah, so commissioning and co-productions, they are the big thing that everyone wants. But I would say think outside the box about how you might approach that, and how you might, over the long term, build partnerships with people so that you find yourself in a place where you are working with an international partner on the development, creation of a piece of work, which will then lead to future dissemination of that work. If that makes sense. Is an associate company similar to co-production commission? Can I ask you to expand on that? I mean, if you're an associate company of an organisation, usually that means you can cheekily ask that organisation explicitly to commission or co-produce your work, if I'm honest. I think that's an answer to Rachel, if that answers your question or not. But I would always, if I was an associate company of a venue, say, hey, yeah, sorry, would you be a commission partner on our new show? Very often when you're an associate company, it's sort of an expectation that you will develop work. Not always. We were an associate company with the Roundhouse for a while, and we were an associate company, 1927, an associate company with the Young Vic for many, many years. And there was an automatic assumption, we will go in, be an associate company for 3 years, we will make a piece of work with them. And we did. And they were a co-production partner. They were probably the co-production partner that gave us the least injection of resource. Most of it came from overseas, but you know, that's just the UK versus internationally. There are less opportunities for investment from overseas, I'll be honest. When 1927, Please Write Back, which was just in Derby recently, it's the first show we've made in our history, except for our very first show, that's been made with only one co-production partner. Brilliantly, it was an international partner, but we didn't get a UK partner. co-production partners, or commissioning partner, because everyone was like, we've got no resource. So it's just worth acknowledging that across the board, people don't have much resource. But it doesn't mean to say there isn't an appetite to kind of collaborate and support and nurture and develop. Great. I'm now going to move a little bit on to something else, which is licensing. When I talk about licensing, what essentially licensing means is something that happens quite a lot internationally, actually, which is when an international venue or a company or an organization asks to buy the rights to work that you've created. And that might be a script, it might be an idea, it might be a concept, it might be a process, or it might be a full production. In order to be able to have a conversation and to license work, you have to own the work. So you have to be the originator of it, and you have to own the respective rights in what you will license. I'm going to talk about some shows that I've licensed so that you can give a sense of it. So I'm saying that actually very often what happens, before I talk about that, is often what will happen, there are some kind of agents and like arts organizations who will kind of say, hey, can we buy your script for X amount of time? And then it can be licensed to another company in a territory to run and present and stage and tour. And I know many companies have done that in the past. That's not something I have experience of, but it is something you can do. So it's basically giving somebody the rights in exchange for a fee to use a script, for example, if your work is text-based. If your work is not text-based or not published or works in that way, it can be a bit tricky, but there are other ways of licensing. So we have a couple of examples that I'm going to share from 1927 around licensing. The first example I'm going to talk about is we make quite a lot of operas, and our operas are all overseas. They very rarely make it to the UK. I think we've presented 3 performances of one of the operas once in Edinburgh, in the International Festival, but everything is overseas. So we made our first opera, having never made opera. We hadn't even seen opera, if I'm honest, in 2012. With the Komische Opera in Berlin. And actually, here's an interesting story around in terms of international influence and how it can influence what you do. The reason we made an opera, having mentioned already the residency that we undertook in Australia, developing our second show, playing table tennis, but being invited to then be commissioned and then to tour that show, the executive producer there brokered an introduction to a colleague and peer of his. He was moving to Europe to take over a new opera house and had an idea for a production. Stephen said to Barry Kosky, who was taking over the opera house, you need to meet 1927, you need to go and see their work. He came to see our work. He invited us to co-create an opera for his opening season. So we were going from, and the show he saw was a show we opened at the Underbelly. So he saw a show that started on a 50-seat stage, ended up being presented on 400-seat stages, and then asked us to make an opera for his 1,400-seat opera house. We'd never seen an opera. But anyway, we did. It was very successful. It is still running 12 years later at the Komische Opera in Berlin in repertoire. And then really importantly, because it was so successful, because it's a fully animated, full-scale magic flute, we have been asked to, we've licensed the production to opera houses in North America, Argentina, Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Poland, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Greece, and Spain. And what that means is we haven't gone, yeah, you can recreate what we've done. We've gone, you can clone what we've done. So we've been, the Komische production has toured internationally. But what we have done is given licenses to those opera houses to buy the rights to restage exactly as we directed, exactly as we designed, exactly as we animated, exactly as we conceived it, to recreate that show with their own singers and their own orchestras. So it is an absolute clone of the show that runs in Berlin. And we've licensed it to some opera house for a limited time of maybe 1 season in repertoire, maybe a 2-week, 10-performance season. Other opera houses have 5-year licenses. Those licenses have given us a fixed payments and fixed royalties that the creators of that work get directly as kind of creatives through 1927. So it has given us huge visibility internationally. It's given us huge audiences that we can report to the Arts Council all the time on, because it is our work that's going out there, and it has underpinned the practitioner's ability to continue making the work we make in theatre and in working in talent development or creative engagement through that trajectory of having licensed that work. It won't die. It keeps going. Everyone loves it. It is a brilliant show. But it is ours, and we can step in at any point and go, no. Importantly, we also have trained some assistant directors who always go out to oversee the restaging of each production in each opera house. That's one example of licensing that we've undertaken. The other example is actually Please Write Back, which we've just had on in Derby, which is still on tour, about to go back on tour next week. Having had a tour pause for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So Please Write Back was actually created as a co-production with the Berg Theatre in Vienna. But we experimented with a new model, which was a co-production and a kind of licensing of the work. So we made the show in England with our ensemble of workshop development performers. We then went out to Austria, and we worked with the Berg Theatre, which is the National Theatre of Vienna of Austria. We worked with their in-house ensemble and their translators, translated into German, and then directed it onto that in-house ensemble in German. They presented it, and we licensed it to be presented at the Berg Theatre in Vienna for 1 year. And we also licensed the ability within that year, if there was interest for it to tour internationally, but only and explicitly only the German language production, and only into the surrounding Germanic neighbours, so into Switzerland, into Germany, and into Austria. And that was the license. And we were really explicit. It could not tour anywhere else because there was a future English language production coming, and that would be the global touring version of the show. It didn't tour nationally because the Berg Theatre don't actually tour particularly, but they insisted. It took forever to negotiate it. But that's another example of a license that was embedded within our co-production agreement, if that makes sense. Anyone have any questions so far about any of that? What I would say with licensing is it comes from nowhere. You can't promote it, you can't push it, you probably can, but it kind of surprises you. What will happen is you get an email in your inbox, which is like, oh, I saw your show. We'd like to stage it in Shanghai. Can we have a conversation? And you're like, you want to stage it? You want us to tour? No, we want to stage it locally. It's worth exploring. It can be a really good way of disseminating what you do. It does require a bit of artistic requisition of control, I guess, or not. If you are explicit, like we have been with the Magic Flute, we're like, it is exactly as it looks and it sounds, the original production on the whole. Great. Next, I'm going to talk about building connections, because I think ultimately I will come back to some of those questions in a second. Lots of questions coming in. Oh my God. Okay, I'm going to carry on and then try and catch up on some of these. So I'm just going to get to the end of this before we go on to touring. So building connections, networking, peer-to-peer working. If you have not worked internationally, and or even if you have, networking and peer-to-peer working is fundamental to being able to do what you do and have international knowledge, understanding, and connections. Like, it's everything. I personally was very privileged before we left the EU many years ago to be part of a project that meant I was part of a program that was a kind of group of artists, arts managers at the time, producers who would kind of meet in 5 countries across an 18-month period, and it transformed what I did. It's completely influenced what I've done. So building networks, these are the things I'm going to suggest are useful to do. Join mailing lists. If you can't join a network, join a mailing list. Find out what opportunities there are. Seek opportunities to build peer networks internationally. Sometimes, really importantly, you can do those within the UK, which I'll come back to in a second. There are international fellowships you can apply for that have call outs. For example, ISPA, which is the International Society of Performing Arts, which is a kind of global network of over 500 arts leaders. They have a fellowship program for global fellows. Arts Council England support 3 fellows a year to participate in ISPA. Highly competitive. I'm going to put my hand up and say I've applied about 10 times, and every time no, and I'm like, oh, I can't afford to go if I don't apply. But you should apply. There are fellowships and opportunities for networks that you can apply to. I've been a member of IETM for about 12 years. People always ask me, what do I get out of it? Do you get bookings? Do you get opportunities? And I'm like, no, I get professional development. I get headspace. I've got friendships across the globe. Those friendships, so important. The ability to ask someone that you know, that you've had a cup of tea with in the morning, or maybe a cup of something stronger later at night, watched a show together, experienced complicated conversations, participated in complicated conversations around the world. I cannot tell you how much it opens your ability to understand how your work and practice is positioned internationally. That's what's key. So understanding space for where you see how to position what you do, and understanding where it's not well positioned is really important. And that's why networking is really vital. There are loads of opportunities to network internationally here at home in the UK. Caravan Assembly happens twice every other year. It's run by Farnham Maltings and Brighton Festival. You can apply to showcase your work. You can also apply to attend some conversations. In Good Company are running stuff all the time. Edinburgh Fringe has opportunities to kind of network, and very often these are spaces where, like Edinburgh or Brighton, there are international promoters present, there are curators present, there are other artists and companies presenting work. It's a really good opportunity just to strike friendships, begin to kind of build a network of contacts that you can go, hey, can we just meet over Zoom? Can I have a conversation with you? In time, those networks become really good friendships. Some of my closest friends are people that I've met through these international contexts of networking. Actually, some of my closest UK peer group are people that I've met in other international contexts repeatedly, because there's a shared allegiance, a shared kind of perspective. Networking and peer-to-peer networking, regardless of international working, everyone needs it. It's your own support network. Do it, invest in it, take the time to do it. Oh, sorry, it's IETM, sorry, not ITM. But I will send all the links over for this. And then to touch on that a little bit further, showcases, platforms, art markets. There are a number of UK contexts that you might present your work in, which are fundamentally showcases. Some formally, some informally, for international promoters. There's not many formal showcases, if I'm honest. There are festivals such as Edinburgh International Festival, London International Festival of Theatre, Manchester International Festival, Gateshead International Festival of Theatre, Mayfest, Chubbuck Festival, Dada Festival, Greenwich and Docklands Festival, Brighton's Festival, Edinburgh Fringe, Edinburgh International Festival. There are venues such as the big ones like Factory International, Barbican Centre or Sadler's Wells, and then smaller spaces like Battersea Art Centre or The Yard, where your work might get curated and presented as a UK practitioner. So it's worth trying to build relationships with some of these people. It's worth going to see work in those contexts, seeing what they're programming, seeing what work is being presented from overseas, to begin to develop understanding and insight into how your work is positioned. And also to build your network, to get to know people, to kind of end up having a coffee or conversation with somebody who runs a whatever festival. They might never program you, but it doesn't mean to say they don't want to not hear from you, and they don't want to not give you some advice about other places and other regions that you might want to engage with. In terms of opportunities to showcase work here, Here and Now is the kind of England showcase that happens for theatre and dance, which happens in the context of the Edinburgh Festival and the Edinburgh Fringe. Caravan Assembly, which happens biannually as well, which happens in the context of the Brighton Festival. Fabric offer in Nottingham offer opportunities for independent dance companies and dance organisations. They're kind of spaces which are deliberately showcasing work to international delegates that they're inviting over. Sadly, the big showcase that we used to have in the UK was the British Council showcase. It used to happen biannually at the Edinburgh Festivals, where theatre and dance was curated and programmed around 30 companies a year, and they would bring over 100 delegates from around the world to see that work, and that would just open doors internationally. Because of the decimation of the British Council and the disinvestment of the British Council, they have not been able to present that. But what I will say is, if you are an artist or company making work within the context of and wanting to showcase it still, for example, in yourselves in Edinburgh, as an example, last year the British Council did bring over 30 delegates from across the globe, and they did curate a programme of England-based artist-made, England-based made work for Northern Ireland and Scotland and Wales. They offered the opportunity, but they basically curated a program for those delegates who were promoters and curators and festival directors to go and see that work. So there are kind of some more invisible showcases that do happen here, where you can get your work seen by international promoters. It is worth inviting people to come and see your work. It is worth trying to get to those places where international delegates or programmers or curators are likely to be, hanging out, seeing whether there are artist development opportunities, artist networking opportunities. There really often are. There's often a remit for that, a necessity for that. Then there are other kind of showcases platforms internationally. There's not many opportunities for us in England to showcase our work in a kind of legitimate way internationally. Other countries will run showcases in other countries. That doesn't happen so much in the UK, but there are sometimes opportunities, and usually those will go with a call out or have a regional focus. There are also a number of arts markets that happen across the globe. So most recently there was CNARS, which happens in Montreal, I want to say, in Canada. There's the Australian Performing Arts Market. There's kind of arts markets. They're all called PAMs or CAM. The Korean Arts Market. There's a China Arts Market. There's Shanghai Arts Market. There's various arts markets and platforms across the globe, which are spaces and places where promoters go who are interested in international work, usually to see work from that region, but also to network and connect with other programmers, promoters from across the globe, and other artists and companies from across the globe. So it's worth researching what those arts markets are and those points are, and whether there might be a way of you somehow finding yourself in that space. Sometimes it's also useful to kind of visit one of those things just to see how it works. If you're considering a DYCP application, it might be it's one of those things that you can include a trip to something to kind of sow seeds, or just to build insight and knowledge. I've been to a few arts markets, and when not presenting work, it can feel a bit weird. It's like people are like, oh, why are you here? You're a producer of a company. And I'm like, well, I kind of want to understand it. And it's also where, like, having run things like Another Route and Total Theatre, it's given me a little bit more legitimacy. But I'm going to be honest, as an artist or as a producer, it's a bit like, why are you here? But, you know, tie it into a local residency, tie it into whatever you want to build. It's a way of kind of, just building visibility and actually showing people, really importantly, that you're serious about working outside of this island. And when people repeatedly begin to see you, they begin to get to know you, they learn to trust you, they'll be honest about whether they're interested in your work, they might start asking you for advice on your peers or practitioners that they would like to know more about. So there's also a thing I would say in terms of internationalizing your creative practice, please be generous to other artists to help them to do it as well. Are there questions? I feel like there's some questions in the chat before we... Does anyone need to take 2 minutes, or are we okay? Should we power on? We haven't got that long, so I'm going to go on to touring. Can I see if there's just a quick check of the... have we answered any of these? Much funding. Yeah, I mean, we can't make any work without some element of public subsidy, if I'm honest, these days. Finding it kind of near on impossible. Not always. We've made shows. We made an opera production last year in Austria. They paid for it. We didn't have to pay for it, raise any money, but our costs were low because it was just our team we were paying for. We weren't paying for the production. Arts Council England are now interested in supporting international work, which they didn't used to be. So it used to be a bit of a game of how you presented that it was an international co-production. It was part of the programme and the project and the thing, but you weren't asking them for money for that work. You can now ask money for that work, but we'll come to touring and presentation in a moment. And it might be you don't need to ask for subsidy for the work that you're doing overseas. It's generally the making and the dissemination here that you need the work for, let's be honest. The British Council, what's the best place to look for funding opportunities? Again, I would just say it's looking at the mailing list. Creative Europe is not accessible anymore at the moment. Creative Europe have a fantastic programme called Perform Europe, which is an incredible new mobility touring, massive investment from the European Commission, and we are not eligible to apply for it. So if I say one political thing here, I'm going to say it this: write to your MPs and request that we rejoin Creative Europe. We do not need to be a member of the EU to participate in Creative Europe. If the government pays into Creative Europe, it will open doors and opportunities for us to be able to potentially participate in some of the schemes and projects, which are the first ways in. Write to your local MP, say we need to be in Creative Europe, articulate why it's vital and essential for what you do. Is there a good way to look at licensing rules, understand better? I mean, I would say talk to other companies is the first thing I would say. It can be territory specific. It depends on what they're asking. Seek advice. Sorry, that's not particularly helpful. Great. Okay, fantastic. Touring. I'm going to talk about touring. I'm going to try and get this in like 20 minutes to give us time for more chat, so you can turn your cameras on and say hello if you want to. You don't have to. So touring, right. First thing, why tour internationally? Genuinely, lots of people want to do it. And I'm going to say, I think you have to ask yourself important, sometimes difficult questions about your work. Is it the important questions about what your work potentially being programmed to be presented internationally is this: most promoters locally will ask, is this work unique? Can I get this work here in my own territory? If I can't get my work here, if I can get this work here, then probably they won't program you. So there's a question about, is your work unique? And this is going to sound a really harsh, and I hate using this term, I'm going to say it: is your work competitively world class? Like, is it the best it could possibly be? And is it equal to any artist working similarly at your level of your experience in your field across the globe? You're working in competition with everybody internationally. So you have to kind of ask yourself that big question. Does your work offer something different? Is it unique? If so, do you understand what its uniqueness is and what its difference is? Think about how you articulate that, how you communicate that, how you convey that. Before you start to tour internationally, or think about touring internationally, with the world as it is at the moment, you really do need to think about geopolitics and ethical considerations, and have that conversation with yourself, with your teams, which is really important to know your red lines. It's really, really important to know where you are happy to work in and where you are not. Which territories internationally are no-go zones for you for whatever reason, which territories are okay zones to go for. You need to know what's happening in the world. You need to really, if you want to work internationally, you really need to like up your international engagement, read newspapers, listen to the radio, like politically understanding geopolitics is vital for working internationally. It's an odd thing to say, like, you need to know, but you can't work in isolation. Do your research. Do your research on venues, do your research on countries. The government have a really fantastic website which lists a profile for every single country in the world. It will say whether it recommends you go there or don't go there as a UK, being based in the UK. It will tell you what you need to think about if you go to those places, those contexts. Really importantly, think about who's on your team and think about safety and think about appropriateness of places you might want to go to or might not want to go to, because people of particular genders or ethnicities or cultural backgrounds or identities would not feel safe working in a particular context. For example, you might want to think about if somebody is trans or homosexual, that maybe there are certain territories in the world where actually it is not safe for them to go to. So maybe you don't want to go there. Like, really think about these things. It is not the United Kingdom. However annoying and frustrating the UK can be, other parts of the world, you need to think about that. And you need to think about the support structures you'll need to put in place. But even before you think about that, it's about where you consider is appropriate for you to go. So yeah, think about geopolitics, think about ethical considerations. Things will change. The world is on fire. 7 years ago, we were touring regularly to Russia. We do not tour to Russia anymore, for example, obviously. But things shift and change in your contacts and whatever change. There is increasingly war, there are natural disasters, it will impact what you do. So I'm also going to say, before you think about touring, think about contingency plans, because you need to have those ready at any point. So tour booking, timelines, how long does it take internationally? Internationally, if you're booking tours internationally, the timelines can be 1 to 3 years. They tend to be much longer. So most venues or festivals are programmed a year or two in advance, venues in particular. Some do have shorter timelines. Some want to be responsive and leave holes in their programs for really kind of current new work. Many festivals, for example, are biannual. So also again, the planning cycle in those instances might be 2-year, 4-year cycles. So, I started a conversation with someone I ran into a while ago about a festival where they're like, well, we're programmed for 2025 and programmed for 2026, but should we talk about 2028? And I'm like, oh my God, it's 2024. But that's the reality, because they might only have a 2-week festival. So you need to be able to plan far in advance, but also you need to be ready to be to be able to respond potentially to really last minute invitations. The British Council doesn't do as much touring support, as much touring as it used to. But when we opened our last show, Roots in Edinburgh, it was before the pandemic, but we presented it in Edinburgh, and we went to Tunisia 2.5 months later because somebody from Tunisia saw the show, and then the British Council helped the Tunisian festival to present it. So it was like, wow, within 2.5 months, we had to quickly turn around a tour. So whilst things take ages, they can also be very last minute. But you need to make sure there's enough time to organise what you need to organise. Okay, in terms of thinking about tour booking and timelines and what you need to prepare, try to work regionally as much as possible. It goes without saying. There's a huge environmental footprint that goes with moving people and stuff around the world. So try to work with venues and festivals to kind of look at whether you can work in a region, whether you're organising that yourself or you're stating to venues who are interested in your work that you would like to tour and maximise your stay in places. Very often, if you go to, for example, South Korea, they will automatically want to see whether there's other partners in the region, because then they can share the costs of bringing you over. The further away you are, the more likely they are to try and find other partners to present your work in the region. Sometimes the region might be a neighbouring country or 2 countries away, or, you know, but like that, it's regions of the world. Do your research, look at venues, look at festivals, see what their programmes are. Don't throw yourself at everyone. Think about whether your work would work there. Understand the scale of the venues, which is hard when you don't know internationally, but it's really easy to Google photographs of spaces where you can go, oh, okay. See where your peers and your competitors, the artists that are most likely who make the work most similar to your work here or internationally, see where they're going. Look at their tour schedules. I steal people's tour schedules all the time. I'm like, okay, might apply to them. They've never been there, but what's the harm? And sometimes I will ask that company to broker an introduction or to ask for a contact email. Yeah, to do your research. Think about why people would want to present your work. Be ready. If you are booking a tour internationally and you know that there is the appetite, there's the interest, and you start doing it, have your assets ready. It's when promoters internationally are interested, it moves super quickly, like super quickly, and also very slowly. So I'm slightly contradicting myself there, but in terms of what they need to finalize things. So the things that you need to have ready at the point of conversation is technical specifications, build plans, come to why in a second, a full film of your work, a full written script of your work. You'll need the marketing copy, design work, images, trailers, company personnel information, and carnet lists. Some of these things I'll come to in a minute. There's more stuff that you would need than you might need for a UK venue. And if you haven't made the show, have the kind of technical footprint ready, like know what your requirements, what you think your requirements are, and promise that you will get a video as soon as it's ready, and get the script as soon as it's ready. The reason we need scripts and videos, sometimes promoters will need to see the video to check they want to program it, but also they might want to see old work if not. If there are censors involved, they will need to show it to the authorities. That's why it's invaluable that you have that information. Also, if you're working in a territory outside of the English language, they will want to translate your work for surtitle projection within the screen, within presentation. I'm now speeding through this, so please do ask me questions, or ask me if it doesn't quite make sense what I'm saying, because I'm going to fly through this, but I will share my notes. Deals. Okay, really importantly, you've got people interested in presenting your work. Deals for international work, they are different to the UK. You should expect easily for venues and festivals to pay a guarantee fee, which you should budget carefully. Alongside that, they will pay your international and domestic travel. They will pay for your visa and work permit costs. They will pay for your freights and custom declarations. They will provide per diems, they will provide accommodation, and they will provide the agreed technical specification requirements and or build requirements. They will also, if translation is necessary, provide translation and surtitles. That's standard. It's the kind of fee plus is what we kind of talk about when we work internationally. But anyone who says there'll be some fringe contexts internationally, they won't meet all of those costs, but that is standard for international working, is that everything is covered. In terms of setting your fee, budget carefully for what that would cost. You might only be presenting 2 performances in France. Let's use France as an example. But you might require a day to set up, or you might get up in the day, put the show on twice, 2 days performances, but you're traveling either side. I personally budget a company for a week, because that's 4 days work. So I'm like, we've gone over the 3 days, they're being paid for a week. So there's not a per performance fee, and there's loads of costs that go with kind of getting ready to get it overseas. So budget carefully in order to determine what your fee is. And if in doubt, maybe ask a company that have worked internationally to look at your budget, to kind of go, does this include everything that it should? Or I can kind of share a template, perhaps following on this, with the kind of stuff that I include, do I need to think about for a particular country. Logistics, lots of logistics. with international touring. Okay, some of this is going to get a little bit technical. So withholding taxes, VAT, social security, and certificates of residence. Each country sets its own tax rules. So if you are presenting a piece of work overseas and you're being paid a piece of work, some work from a venue or company overseas, they will have potentially a requirement by their local their country authority to withhold money to you. So when you are negotiating deals, you need to ask venues and companies, venues or presenters, promoters, is there, like, you need to be clear about going, are there taxes involved? Because the fee I'm quoting you is a net fee. It needs to be net of deductions. So that they're very clear that and then some will add it on. So they will up your overall fee because a deduction will be made. Withholding taxes usually means that there's an agreement between one country and the United Kingdom that you will deal with your taxes and your taxes here. So you apply, so you put in a load of paperwork, and it means that you agree to pay your taxes here so that the venue overseas doesn't have to withhold any money from your fee. Sometimes VAT needs to be included. VAT, you don't charge VAT overseas if you're registered for VAT here in the UK, but it doesn't mean so that the country overseas doesn't have to charge VAT. So they might deduct VAT from your fee. So again, that's where you're negotiating a net fee, not a gross fee. Really importantly, it's a bit of a minefield. Every country is different. When you're presenting a piece of work overseas, ask the venue, are there any taxes, VAT, social security, things that I need to apply for? They will usually tell you this is what you need to do. What usually happens is there's then a form that needs completing. They send you a form, you complete it. We send it to HMRC, HMRC stamp it, they send it back to us, we send it overseas. Since Brexit, HMRC are dealing with an awful lot of declarations and stamping. So what I would say is just a really big tip is cash flow, be ready. It can take a long time. We wait 2.5 years for a load of tax forms to come back from HMRC last year. Because they'd had a backlog because of Brexit and because of the pandemic. There are sometimes certificate residence, which again you can kind of apply for from HMRC, but sometimes there are overseas tax forms you have to complete. But the promoter should be able to tell you what's needed. Sometimes in some territories, those forms also need to be have a notary on them, which means that they need to be legally stamped by an official notarizer, legal person. Usually those are when you're performing in countries that, for various reasons, have extra financial controls on them. So we performed in, where have we performed? So if we presented work in Argentina, for example, we had to go and get things properly notarized and take stuff to somebody, and that cost more money. So I would also say make sure you put some legal costs in your budgets for your fees that you're negotiating, because they can cost money unexpectedly, or sometimes they can just cost postage and backwards and forwards and bits and bobs. If you are a solo artist, there might also be some social security stuff that you need to think about, which again, ask the authority. So in Europe, there might be particular things that you need to get extra social security declarations. And again, the rule is generally to say, I will pay my tax and national insurance here, so you don't need to deduct it there. And it will be HMRC saying, yes, this person will, or this organisation will, pay whatever is due here if something is due. And if you're a company and a charity, you won't be paying anything because you don't pay corporation tax. If you are a not a company, you might have to pay some corporation tax if you make a profit. National insurance you just pay here as usual if you are on PAYE or at the end of your tax return each year. Does that make sense? Anyone got any questions? I'm trying to not go into too much detail other than saying ask people, get ready. Withholding taxes, VAT, social security, certificates of residence come up repeatedly across the globe when you tour or work internationally, but each country sets its own rules. So there's not one rule for all. Again, ask other peers, other companies. There's an arts information point also, that's a resource. I'm going to share a load of resources which will pinpoint to who to ask if you find yourself in a place where you need to ask a question about this. I mentioned, I'm going to talk about a little bit about censors and censorship, because there is censorship in the world. And if you're working internationally, it's something that you might have to think about, not always, but sometimes. When I mentioned having scripts and videos ready, I've often toured to China with work. China, in order to present your work in China, the censors in China need to approve your work. So they need to watch the videos and they need to read the script. They will do that before the contract becomes active to say, yes, this company is allowed to present your work. So you will often, in many places, need censors' approval to be able to present your work. Sometimes censors will come back and say, no, this work cannot be presented here because of whatever the content is. Sometimes they will come back and say, please, can you make this change? And you will need to think about whether you want to make those changes. So I'm going to use an example that we toured one of our shows, the previous shows, Routes to China last year, and we had some animated Greek statues with a nipple exposed. It was an animation of a statue from the Greek era. The Chinese authorities asked us to animate over the nipple because we weren't allowed nudity on stage. I mean, madness, kind of bizarre. They missed other things that happened in the show that were slightly more confrontational, and sometimes and there was a line in the show where we said, it was a kind of said in jest, oh, it just mentions the President of the United States of America, and they asked us to remove that line, and we had to change it to something else. So censors are kind of worth thinking about, and it might mean you don't want to work in a territory where there is artistic censorship. Yes, so there are permissions in some places. Visas and work permits, bit of a minefield. I'm going to blast through this because I'm realizing we're running out of time. I'm going to try and leave time for 5 to 10 minutes of questions at the end. Visas and work permits. So a visa, they're two different things. Sometimes they're used interchangeably. A visa is a document that allows the bearer who is traveling to enter a country. A work permit is the thing that enables that bearer to undertake work, what is considered work in that country. Sometimes you need one, sometimes you need both. Sometimes they are the same thing, depending upon the type of visa you've got. Most UK passport holders will require a visa now to work in most countries other than Ireland. The timelines and processes can be long. In order to work out whether you need a visa, ask the presenter, check embassy websites. So check that country's local embassy website and just do your research as well. Again, I direct you to the government's country by country profiles that they have in the FCO department, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and they will tell you whether you need a visa. You also need to check whether you need a visa in certain territories in order to undertake work, particularly if you're touring. So, for example, in Europe, touring in Europe at the moment, now we've left the EU, you do not need a visa to travel to the Schengen area, which is the EU plus some other countries, but not all of the EU countries, as long as you don't stay for more than 90 days and 180 days. But in most of those places, if you're going to present work on stage, you will need a visa, and you will need to check with each country what is needed. And whilst the EU is a member state, and generally you will get a Schengen visa, the Schengen visa will enable you to work in that country that you're visiting to present the work. It might not provide you the ability to present in another neighbouring country. So you just need to be really clear when you talk to the embassies, when you talk to the promoters about what is needed. There's lots of resources online sharing information around this now. Also, just to say that two really big things to kind of say around Europe. One is that there's a new ETIAS system that's coming in, it's a border entry system that's coming in the new year. I think you'll be on board in spring 2025, which means that even if you're not working in Europe, you will need to have you will need to register your details in order to enter and travel amongst any European countries. And the other thing to really emphasize is the 90 in 180 day rule. If you tour to America, to Australia, to, I don't know, Asia, to various countries, there's not really any rules about how long you can stay or how many visits you can do. And no other, they're not working in collegiate with any other countries. They all are independent individual. The EU is working as a bloc, so you are not allowed to work in or be in collectively any of those countries for more than 90 days in any 180 days. There are ways around that, and there are exceptions. There are exceptional visas that enable you to do that. I will use an example of this. Last year, 1927, we made a TV show which was being filmed in Prague at the same time that across the same 9-month period that we were making an opera in Austria. We had to go backwards and forwards, and we thought we were worried we were going to go over the 90-day rules, and then all the actors and writers worldwide in America went on strike, so it ceased filming, which then really did present a problem, and we did tip over the necessity for us to be in Europe for more than 90 days. But really brilliantly, because we were making a TV show, we got an exceptional visa for Prague, for Czechia, which meant that actually it wasn't counted in our 90 days. So there are ways around it. Generally, as a performance maker, if you're just touring, you'd speak to each country, see what you can do, but know the 90 and 180 day rules. There are online calculators. The EU has one, so you can track the days left within any given period, and each 90 days starts each day, if that makes sense. So it's constantly changing and constantly evolving. Yeah, really look into your visas. It takes a long time. I'm slightly nervous. We're going to Japan next month, and I still don't have the certificates that are needed from Japan in order to submit the applications for the visas here. And I'm a bit like, are we going to get them in time? If you don't have a visa, it can mean a tour can fall apart. Other legal things, logistics, carnets, customs declarations. If you are moving things along with you, your stuff, so your costumes, your set, your props, your instruments, any kit you've got, you will probably need to have some customs declarations. Before we left the EU, we can move in and out of Europe with all the stuff we liked and no one asked a question. Now, the EU is treated as per the rest of the world, and we generally have to get customs declarations. The most standard form of customs declaration is a ATA carnet, which ultimately is a passport for your kit. So it's I should have had one here. Oh, in fact, no, I do. This is a carnet, so I can show you it, so people can see. That's a carnet list. So it lists every single item that is in a show that we tour. And that's for a show that tours not with freight, but as excess baggage. So the company carry it with them, but we have to declare what we are bringing in and out of the country with us. And basically it's a passport for your stuff. And it's a declaration that what you bring in, you promise to take out. So you're not taking stuff or smuggling stuff into a country and leaving it there. It is about that. It does cost money and it does take time to organise. They're organised through the Chamber of Commerce. If I give you one tip, my tip is work with a freight agent. They will help you do it and they will hold your hands through the process. You will pay them an admin fee for it. It's tiny, it's a couple of £100. Do it. Honestly, I only know about it because they've helped me do it over time. And every single thing needs to be dictated. Every single thing needs to be listed. Whether that's like 400 screws on a piece of kit needs to be detailed, and you need to detail the kind of cost of those things. So you're declaring what the goods are, serial numbers for any electronic kits, and the value of it. You might want to be careful or clever about how much value you declare it's worth, because that will impact how much the carnet costs. Some promoters will pay the cost of the carnet, not all, just a heads up. So again, I would always budget for a carnet within your budget for the tour. The other legal piece of paperwork you might need is if you're taking instruments or particular items that have, so start again. If you have something that contains a protected material, if you are traveling with a violin that has an ivory bow, you will need to get a CITES certificate, which basically dictates, which will give an information to say, this bow contains this, and it is a 500-year-old bow. It's okay, it's allowed to move around the country, around the world. Equally, if you're carrying a violin, as a really good example, a violin is something that very often you have to get either a CITES declaration or a musical instrument declaration. And the musical instrument certificate declaration that will state that that violin and that bow contains no protected materials. It might be that you have a vintage costume that uses vintage feathers from a species which is now a protected species. You will need a piece of certificate that gets attached to you moving it. You don't have to show it with anybody, but you need to organise those CITES certificates, because if you get stopped at customs by border control in any context, you can go, I'm not smuggling this is what this is, here's my carnet, this is what I'm doing, this is my purpose of being here, and it's accepted. Does that make sense? And then again, I'm going to send a list of like pinpointing for resources where you can kind of find information on this, and it will give you advice on where to apply. But for example, with CITES certificates and musical instrument certificates, often go into a music shop and they'll tell you who they know that does it, because people have to do it all the time. It's not all instruments, it's not all kit. It's usually like we have it for violins and violas when they travel, but I've never had to have it before. You might also, on that note, want to think about what you transport internationally. Some things you won't be able to. We have a donkey's jaw in one of our shows, which just is an instrument that kind of was found here, that can't travel. We don't attempt to travel that because it's an odd thing. Just a quick note on shipping and cabotage. On shipping, if you need to ship, work with a freight agent. Don't do it yourself, genuinely. And even if you don't work with a freight agent, contact a freight agent, get their advice, ask them what's needed for documentation, declaration, ask them for costs, take their advice, do it yourself. But sometimes it's easier just to get them to do it. And if you've negotiated a presenter supporting freight costs, they'll just pay the cost. What I would say is think about what you're transporting, minimize what you need to travel with. Don't take things that can be sourced, provided, built overseas, locally. Think about the environment. Try not to double up what you're transporting. We try to put things into suitcases and ski bags so we can travel with them with us on trains and on planes. If you are taking large items, be mindful that there is a thing called volumetric weight that happens when you freight things. I mean, the larger they are, it doesn't matter how much they weigh, it begins to take a different measurement, and it's charged at a different price. So you want to, when you're constructing sets or things that you definitely will tour internationally, you need to make them to be able to pack down as tightly as possible, because it will minimize how much it costs when you do need to move it. Be mindful when you tour into Europe, there is a cabotage rule, which means that you can only stop 3 times once you've left the UK in a place, before the stuff you brought into the country needs to move out of the country. I'm not going to say much about cabotage. There are ways around it. There are companies working out how to do it. But be aware, if you're touring Europe, you might, and you've got freight, you might need to think about this rule. Environmental considerations, like moving people and stuff has an impact, has a footprint. Do so as responsibly as you can, minimize that footprint. Like I say, don't take people, don't take stuff if you don't need to. Think about whether you can slow travel, slow tour, take time to take trains to places. If you do that, you should be paying everyone along the route. It can be very expensive. Sometimes you don't need to slow travel. You can just take trains. In Western Europe, you can take trains. Also be aware, though, that not everyone has the infrastructure to enable that, and we need to be mindful of that. And then the other thing is just in the mix of kind of movement of people and things is going back to the geopolitical awareness. Be aware of what's happening. We once undertook a tour in the Caucasus, and I'm hoping I'm going to say the countries correctly, Azerbaijan and Armenia, I believe, or Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia and Ukraine. We went to those 4 countries, and 2 of the countries are side by side. But in order to move, but we couldn't move between them. We had to structure the tour in a way that meant we weren't moving between them because they weren't talking to each other. Going back to passports, and so going back to applying for visas. Sometimes some countries won't give you a visa if you have a stamp from another country which they are not on good terms with. You can, if you are a UK passport holder, you can get a second passport. There is grounds to apply for a second passport if you can make a case for either one of two things. For business reasons, you've got so many visas you need to apply for. You need the ability to have one being applied for visas while using the other one on traveling. I have two visas, two passports. Most of 1927 have two passports because we've done so much traveling. The other reason is so that you don't have a stamp. So perhaps the wrong example now, but a historic example might have been, for example, some Middle Eastern countries would not accept an Israeli stamp. They probably definitely now would not accept an Israeli stamp on your passport. So sometimes that's just a case to kind of go, okay, that's fine. Can I get a second passport? And you just need to think about what is in your passport. Or if you go to America, what stamps you might have on your passport that they might question. I'm going to say another thing around passports and your teams you work with is not everyone will be a UK passport holder. That will throw up questions and considerations that you will need to think about. We have a wonderful Colombian production manager, collaborator we've worked with. And I repeatedly, whenever we tour around the world, have seen one of two things. One, that their visa process takes a lot longer. And secondly, that they will always get called to the desk as we're checking in and asked extra questions. And it's kind of like, whoa. So be mindful of this, really think about this, and really think about territories that you might not want to work in for that reason or for the safety of those individuals. And that includes what might be considered safe territories for most people, might not be for others. Going back to the EU, if anyone in your company has an EU passport, you don't need to apply for visas. Get them to, yeah. My Irish passport has taken me years to apply for. Get them, use them. Really quickly, running out of time. Oh my God, we've only got 5 minutes. Okay, we started 5 minutes late, so maybe we can finish. Just two quick headlines. Make sure you have insurance. Make sure you have healthcare. If you work internationally, insurance policies can be, if you've got a combined theatre policy, for example, you can usually extend it. Internationally, people will expect you to have public liability. They will expect you to have employer's liability. If you're moving stuff, you probably also need marine insurance. Most combined performance policies will cover for all of this. You might just need to extend it for a territory or for a period of time. And definitely make sure you've got travel insurance and medical insurance for everybody. The only thing I'm going to finish up with is that touring's a privilege. It's joyous, it's lovely, but also there's responsibility that goes with it. So be sensitive to cultural specifics of places that you're visiting. Be mindful of your international peers and don't place them in spaces that might be tricky for them or cause problems for them if they're in particular territories. And enjoy it. Oh, I talk for hours. Gosh, okay. 5 minutes or so of questions if anyone has anything.